Dr. Anthony Fauci was grilled by Republican lawmakers yesterday as he testified before the House's Select Subcommittee on the coronavirus pandemic. Republicans questioned Fauci of a variety of topics, including the basis for his public health recommendations and emails. Fauci defended himself and he claims that he orchestrated a cover-up of COVID origins. Democrats largely praised Fauci throughout the hearing. Here's a glimpse of some of the chaos that ensued.
You said you represent science. Do you represent science, Mr. Fauci? Yes or no? Yes or no?
No, that's not a yes or no answer.
Yes, it's a yes or no.
I don't think it is.
Okay, well, we'll take that as a you don't know what you represent.
Joining us now to discuss is Republican Senator Rand Paul. Welcome back to the program.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So you have previously accused Dr. Fauci of potentially misleading Congress when he denied that gain-of-function research was funded in Wuhan by the U.S. government. We've had a lot of updates since then, particularly with this top deputy of his admitting to stonewalling the FOIA process, to changing characters in words so it'd be harder for journalists and independent news organizations to get that information. What do you make of what took place yesterday and Fauci's continued defense of some of those actions?
I think one of the most surprising things was how quickly he threw his aide under the bus. David Morenz has worked for 20 years for Anthony Fauci, and in his opening statement, he says, barely knew the guy. He had an office in another building. Hardly ever saw him, wasn't included in my policy meetings. And so essentially they've thrown David Morenz to the wolves now, but David Morenz has admitted that he destroyed evidence, that he deleted emails, that he used his government phone. He also offered up that he was a personal courier and that he could take personal messages to Anthony Fauci's house. He also said that Tony, he thinks, has cleaned up his email by deleting things. And he tells Peter Daszak from EcoHealth in his emails, I think we're safe now. I've deleted all those emails. I think we're safe now. If that doesn't warrant further scrutiny or prosecution, I don't know what does. But his testimony directly conflicts with what Anthony Fauci said yesterday, who said he never used private email, never used a private phone. And so really, I think there needs to be further investigation to find out who's telling the truth here.
Yeah, I wanted to ask exactly about that. What sort of follow-up do you hope to see, or what's already in progress following these new revelations? Is there a possibility of more forensic examination of the technology to get emails or other kind of information that might have been deleted? And what do you hope to see in terms of accountability coming from all of this?
My suggestion to the House COVID committee has been that they should ask Dr. Morenz if he'd like to complete his testimony now that he's heard Anthony Fauci's testimony. Because Anthony Fauci essentially has called David Morenz a liar. David Morenz's emails have implicated him as breaking federal law by destroying evidence. And so I think there is a real question. Does now Dr. David Morenz wish to correct the record? Does he wish to discuss more completely what was going on with Anthony Fauci? Because Anthony Fauci basically disowned him yesterday. And I think if there were a prosecution, this is a kind of pivotal point at which a prosecutor with certain probably negotiations with Morenz could get him to give a more complete picture of what was going on. We know that there was a back channel. There was a scientist at Boston University they were using as a back channel. In one of the emails, David Morenz and Peter Daszak are communicating, and David says, Tony wants me to use the back channel. Tony doesn't want us to talk directly anymore. We need to use the back channel, which is a scientist at Boston University. So when Fauci was asked about this, he says he'd never heard of a back channel. But I think they let him get off too easily because Morenz is saying there was a back channel. And this all is done to evade scrutiny. But the intriguing thing is when you get back to the issue at hand, was dangerous research going on in China? Was it gain of function? And why were we funding it? Anthony Fauci still says it wasn't gain of function. He says the regulatory definition, it never met the regulatory definition of the safety committee. The safety committee was called the P3CO committee. The problem with that line of argument is that Anthony Fauci never submitted the Wuhan research to the safety committee. So he can say we're using that definition, but the committee never considered it. There was never any consideration by the safety committee of whether this was gain of function. Now, I've asked the NIH, was there internal deliberation? Did you guys have a discussion? Did you have scientists presenting the evidence for why this was not gain of function? I'm assuming that happened, but the NIH will not reveal that to me. I've asked for 3 years for it. Last year, almost a year ago, I had the Democrat chairman sign a letter with me. We still don't have that information. In fact, it is my conclusion that the NIH is actually more secretive than the CIA, and that's alarming and disturbing and really should not be tolerated.
That's incredible. You know, I was a little surprised by the level of defense of Fauci I heard from some Democrats at the committee hearing yesterday, because the Democrats, many representatives, were very critical of the things that Morin said, critical of him. The Biden Health Department has taken action now against Eco Health Alliance. Its own Energy Department thinks that the lab leak was more likely. The New York Times now had a great opinion piece on why the lab leak is more likely. There's my point being that there's tremendous bipartisan, cross-ideological. It's not, you know, it's nothing at stake for the parties, really, in terms of this question of whether that improper research was done and that was the origins of COVID. And I'm glad to see, you know, Democrats working with you, for instance, to get more information. But then at this committee hearing, it did suddenly feel partisan again. Do you know why? Do you have thoughts about why that might be the case with Fauci particularly?
I can only surmise that there is such a love for central authority and such a love for government being in charge of healthcare that they see Anthony Fauci as representing central authority, the authority on healthcare, that they see it as an attack on government. Whereas I see it as an attack on his judgment. Basically, he said in 2012 that, yes, a pandemic could occur from a lab leak. If it did, though, that the knowledge gained would be worth the risk. And really, that judgment call, I think, is a horrible judgment call, and is a call that basically we now have a pandemic where maybe 15 million people died worldwide or more. And the conclusion from, I would say, their families and people who are concerned might be that, you know what, the knowledge wasn't worth the risk. In fact, there's a whole group of scientists that have been debating this for over a decade, well before COVID. And many of them say that this type of research has not produced a vaccine, has not produced useful information, but that the risk greatly outweighs the knowledge that comes from this. And that really we should treat this the same way we treat nuclear weapons. You know, at one point they agreed no longer to have explosions of nuclear weapons testing in the air and then underground and all these things. We have nuclear arms treaties. We need to be treating this as something equivalent to nuclear weapons, in the sense that there needs to be negotiations between countries. There needs to be the civilized countries coming together and signing bans on this type of research. This is like, should we develop neurologic weapons? Should we develop biological weapons? There is such a treaty, but it's kind of gone into disfavor over the last several years. And I'm trying to resurrect this, not only domestically. I have a bill that will have more controls on taxpayer-funded gain-of-function research, but also once we pass that, which I hope we will this year, my hope is to go beyond that and to begin having more meetings among the international civilized countries to try to have voluntary bans from countries on doing this dangerous research.
Yeah, or if the research has to be done, at the very least, it needs to be done in circumstances where the lab safety is up to caliber. And so many of those emails that we've now seen where our scientists admit to misleading the regulators about how much safety would be employed in China. You know, if this research needs to be done, can it be done in the Arctic, on the moon? So, you talk about the bans and doing nuclear testing underground and things like that. If they can make the case for the importance of it, well, under the strictest safety standards, okay, fine. But the people involved in funding this clearly didn't care and were resistant to letting the public and the regulators know about what the safety standards would be.
One of the emails we got through federal court order says that if they find out they're doing this in China in a BSL-2, which is a lower category of safety than is required, people will freak out. That's the words from some of the researchers going back and forth between North Carolina, China, and Peter Daszak, who is the bag man collecting all the taxpayer money for this. He said they'll freak out if they find out this is happening in China. So one of the reasons that some people conclude that this came from a lab or could have is that the safety level was so low. The history of accidents in this lab were significant. We also have evidence that 3 members of that lab became sick in November with a pneumonia of unknown origin, and that in all likelihood they may have been the 3 first people to be infected by COVID-19, and that they actually worked in this gain of function lab. And to put this in perspective so people can think about what we're talking about, think about the advisability of taking Ebola. Ebola is 50% lethal, and it's typically transferred by bodily fluids, similar to HIV. So it's not transmitted through the air. Would it be a good idea to fund a laboratory experiment where we take Ebola and say, wow, if we can put these 5 or 10 mutations in, let's see if it can be aerosolized and spread through the air. No, that's sort of a death wish for the world, to try to take a deadly disease that is transmissible, but we know how it's transmissible and we can stop the line of transmission and say, let's spread it through the air, where we have almost nothing really works very well. All the stuff we tried with COVID, really none of it really worked. The virus ended up spreading throughout the entire world, and that's what happens. But it would be sort of a death wish for the world to be committing experiments where we try to aerosolize very deadly viruses. And so those kind of things just shouldn't happen. Thoughtful people ought to just say, well, you may be curious if you can do this, but that curiosity is potentially a disaster for mankind.
Senator Paul, thank you so much for joining us today to discuss this. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.